Good afternoon. We're coming to you live from the Old Thomas Cook in Horsham, and we're sponsored today by Haifa Studios, who place creatives in unused shops. So the title today is Grandad's Memoirs, which is apt for Claire, but not for me, because he's actually my dad. You can see him in the film in the background there, which is quite strange for me. He died on October the 1st, 2018, aged 93. So that makes his birth date, well, you can't tell his birth date, but you can tell he was born in 1925. The title Memoirs is a bit misleading. He wrote lots of autobiographical writings, and we're going to be dipping into them today. He didn't actually write a memoir as such. But the first thing we're going to be reading is called Born Over a Stable, and it's about his early life in 1920s and 1930s Brighton, in a mews in Kemp town, trendy area now, but not so much then. And we'll start in a moment. Born Over a Stable. Well, not quite, because by 1925, most of the stables in Marine Terrace mews had been converted into garages. Only number one was unaltered, with the mangers and wooden partitions curving downwards from the wall. Mother said that the head coachman had lived in our flat, and certainly for 10 shillings a week, it was probably the best in the mews. Originally, there was a connecting door from our sitting room into the next flat, boarded up, where we lived at number 10. Whether this was the arrangement all the way along, so that the head coachman could knock anybody up when required, I don't know. But this would seem somewhat intrusive. And anyway, all the stables belonged to the different houses in Marine Parade. And who would have conferred the status of head coachman? And for what reason? We had a kitchen with a wooden dresser, a kitchener for cooking and providing hot water, no doubt considered state-of-the-art in 1860, and a copper. The kitchener was later replaced by a sort of Queen Anne stove with cabriole legs which perched on bricks. When the southwesterlies blew, tongues of flame leapt from this stove, nearly scorching the backside of anybody sitting at the table. To remedy this, the landlord put a revolving cowl on our chimney, and in high winds this sounded like a wheelbarrow being trundled over the roof. Then, unaccountably, the noise ceased. When I visited Maynard's, the confectioner in Bristol Road, Mrs. M said, "I've got something for you. Could it be a free sample?" She brought out a large object wrapped in newspapers. It was our cowl, which has been snatched off by the gale and deposited in her yard. Gas had been laid on them in the mews when it was built, providing our lighting before George installed electricity. I remember how fragile the mantles were. Merely to touch one was to risk breakage. There were 2 bedrooms and a large 2-windowed sitting room, not lounge, a lavatory, which was also always referred to as such, never toilet. Bathrooms were unheard of luxuries in such properties those days. So we washed in the sink, boiling up water in a kettle. There was some slight evidence of the head coachman in our bookcase, which stood in front of the blocked-off doorway. A large Victorian volume called The Horse was illustrated with lithographs depicting not only horses, but realistically coloured piles of dung. It was just possible that the book belonged to my maternal grandfather, because many years before he ran a livery stable in Ewell and was later coachman to Lord Lucas of Warnham Court. When the family moved to Brighton, he drove a cab plying for hire at the station. My brother George wrote a light-hearted book about Marine Terrace, and when I suggested Comic Muse for a punning title, I don't think he appreciated the classical allusion. It was never published, but I still have his script. How much I can safely glean from it is problematical, because George had a weakness for funifying and elaborating fact, and being 10 years my senior, was describing people and events of an earlier period. He also concealed their identities under pseudonyms, but wherever I quote from his book and can recognize who they were, I shall use their real names. The earliest record I have found of my mother's tenancy was in Pike's 1921 directory, and my brother told me that he could not remember living anywhere except number 10, being only 3 at his earliest recollection. This would agree with the photograph group here, which included my father, still in army uniform, taken in 1918. A happy smile may be because the war had ended, or it may have been simulated, anticipating the last big push against the Germans. There's another photograph taken in France. He's not smiling in that one, and there's a haunted look about his eyes. Mother said he just had a rough time up the front. My brother George was born in 1915, when his father was at the front, and my mother's antenatal care would have been basic, even non-existent. She wouldn't have been hospitalized for the delivery, and I can visualize one of those Hollywood emergency scenes with some kindly neighbor calling for lots of hot water and urging my mother to push, dear, push. Whatever George's entry into the world was like, on Cis, my mother's eldest sister made sure mine should be easier. Aunt Tot, a second cousin of my mother, was summoned from Billingshurst, then a small village, but now an ugly red brick sprawl, my brother describing her as a rather taciturn, bird-like creature. But being country-bred, she probably knew how to go about things. Having lost her husband some 5 months earlier, and faced with the necessity of finding food, rent, and clothing, my mother was up and about soon after my birth. Like most other working-class women of her time, she had no professional training of any kind, apart from what she learnt in service. In her case, black leading grates and general household chores. She occupied a very lowly place in the domestic hierarchy, and told me that on winter days she had to break the ice on the jug in her freezing attic room before she could wash. So with a baby and a 10-year-old son, my mother got down on her knees and scrubbed floors for a pittance. 3 odd pence an hour was the going rate. My brother sometimes acted reluctantly as nursemaid. I began to learn another accomplishment, the care of the very young. The difficulty of the task was aggravated by the fact that my young brother Maurice had the disturbing habit of choking on everything at the drop of a hat, and I became quite skilled in the recovery of small objects from a tiny windpipe. I did mention my brother's weakness for literary embroidery, but I certainly do remember one occasion when he was playing a game of knockabout football with his mates on Whitehawk Hill. A boy casually informed him that I was choking. Indeed, I was. I'd swallowed one of those ryegrass tops. Children threw them as darts. There was only one way for it to go, downwards. I remember coughing until I must have been red or blue in the face, but mercifully the thing came up at last. I was evidently not an easy child to mind. He also determined at all times to resist my attentions, refusing to accept the absence of his mother until I hit upon the brilliant idea of impersonating her. I discovered that if I donned a coat and hat belonging to her, he would subside into sobbing silence. It is a ploy which I pass on freely to all babysitters as well worth consideration, but with the proviso not to forget that you are so disguised and proceed into the open as I did, to the scorn of my schoolmates. This story at least is not apocryphal. My mother well remembered the occasion when I ruined her best and probably only coat. She arrived to find George as described. "I'm wet through," he complained bitterly. Many years later, he recalled the hazards which surrounded my early childhood. He once detached a box on wheels to the back of his bicycle, seated me on it, and rode hell for leather down Duke's Mound. According to George, I much enjoyed the experience, clapping my chubby hands gleefully. I wasn't so lucky on other occasions, riding on the crossbar. "Keep your legs away from the wheel," he warned. And if you've ever experienced this mode of transport, you will appreciate it is certainly not the most comfortable. It's practically impossible to keep your legs wide enough for any length of time, and my foot caught in the front wheel, precipitating us both over the handlebars. We were taken home on the back of a brewer's dray, and my twisted foot needed hospital attention. Then there was a raft incident. But Maurice had his uses. It was about this time that my friends and I went through the raft craze, where everybody made makeshift floating objects. Our first raft consisted of some punctured drums crudely lashed together with rope, with a few pieces of wood over the top. When completed, there came the problem of the test, none of us being anxious to entrust ourselves in the rather choppy sea we were about to launch it on. The solution, of course, was obvious. Use Maurice. It was argued that, being small, it would not unduly strain the craft, and that he wouldn't struggle, being unaware of any danger. So off bobbed the cranky object, with Maurice planted firmly in the middle, secured with the last piece of rope. He seemed to like it, nodding and chuckling, and we viewed the progress with some pride until it became apparent that it was moving too far from the shore and out of our control. It is perhaps fortunate for all, especially for Maurice, that a corporation boatman was on duty at this particular beach, recovering Maurice just prior to the complete disintegration of our raft. It is odd that this episode failed to leave a scar on his mind, for he later joined the Royal Navy. George is about 18 in the photograph, and knowing his Lotharionic propensity, I expect there's a girl somewhere in the offing, possibly Connie Hope, an attractive girl from across the way, or the German girl in the Bloomsbury Place boarding house, or even the girl to whom I had to write an apologetic letter in childish writing on his behalf. Most certainly it wasn't the fat girl Aunt Maud had arranged for him to take skating. On that occasion, my mother met her with apologies. Or perhaps it was... But the list is endless. George's willful and mischievous streak lasted from childhood to advanced adult years. He was an incorrigible practical joker, and perhaps sometimes carried things a bit too far. Mother told me that her husband George warned, "You're going to have trouble with that boy." She certainly did have. I suppose he lacked a father's corrective hand during the war years, and my arrival couldn't have helped matters. Having passed through the grief of losing her husband, my mother said that my arrival was a blessing. No wonder George's nose was put out of joint. Cousin Brenda said that when he was not yet 10, he remarked, "Now that Dad's dead, I can have his watch." This sounds callous, but young children can't always find the right words to express their deeper feelings. Quite often they come out all wrong and hurtfully. George always wanted his own way and usually got it. Aunt Edith once took him as a small boy to the dentist. "Will it hurt?" he asked. She assured him that it would be quite painless. His behaviour in the chair was beyond reproach, but afterwards the floodgates burst. "You said it wouldn't hurt, and it did." He had a short fuse and a heavy hand, which I felt more than once. I suppose I was the favourite among my aunts and uncles, and Aunt Cis was my godmother. This must have rankled with George, who after all was in loco parentis, and as the main wage earner did deserve more credit. George recalled one of his early disappointments. As a small child, he was invited to a Christmas dinner at our step-relatives. Chicken was not often, if at all, on the menu after our father died. Having keenly anticipated the feast, my brother was disgusted at being given the parson's nose. His childhood was not always one of carefreedom. I can recall Grandfather Wood because as he grew more infirm, I was detailed off to scrub out the main hallway and passages to number 87 Marine Parade at the age of 11. Also to stoke up the large coke furnace which fed the antique central heating to the flats above. I also recall the wicked stepmother because Olive, a cousin on the step side of the family, was sucking and blowing a round whistle you got out of sherbet packets, and she said, "Don't suck that, give it to George." Needless to say, I swallowed the damn thing right away. Many anxious scrutinies for some time. Wicked stepmother must be explained. My mother, her two sisters Maria and Maud, and brother Morton suffered a wretched childhood. Their first mother died when they were still small children, and knowing her end was near, she washed and ironed all the linen and children's clothes so as to make an orderly exit from the world. So with 4 young children, all below the age of 10, my grandfather looked for a replacement mother. Charlotte, a widow with a young son of her own, was, according to my mother, a very attractive girl, which was confirmed by an enlarged framed photograph I once saw. She and Grandfather Wood were married at the parish church of Horsham St Mary's in 1888. The seating hasn't altered much since then, and I sometimes picture the two parties sitting on either side of the aisle in the front pews. Morton, in Norfolk suiting and Eton collar, looking across speculatively at his future stepbrother Jack, and my mother, aged 4, and her 2 sisters in frilly white dresses. George Wood's father was a farm bailiff at Warnham, and I wonder what sort of conveyance he provided for the occasion, if any. 3 other children of the second marriage soon arrived, making the little house in Lincoln Street, Brighton, both cramped and hovering on a financial brink. Charlotte was a dressmaker, and with the aid of her sewing machine added to the meagre wages provided by grandfather. He once drove a horse and van for Wallace Holder and Lee, wholesale grocers in North Road. I mentioned earlier that he drove a cab from the Brighton station. They were not allowed within the station yard and had to queue up down Terminus Road. The cast iron signs are still on the wall. HCS, which abbreviates Hackney Carriage Stand. My mother used to hurry down Carlton Hill with his meat pudding in a bowl tied up in a cloth to be consumed, presumably whilst awaiting the Victoria train. Charlotte's treatment, particularly of my mother, the youngest of the first family, was harsh, not to say cruel. My mother often recounted stories of her wretched childhood, and one incident will serve to illustrate this. Aunt Cis was a bright girl, and one day the headmistress announced that Maria Wood has been selected to become a pupil teacher. This was the first step towards qualification. Children clustered excitedly round my aunt as she bore the letter home. My stepmother glanced at it briefly. "Service for you, my girl," was her laconic response as she flung the letter in the fire. Years later, when Charlotte was a frail old woman, she asked Aunt Cis, "Will you forgive me?" My aunt said that she had forgiven her, but she could never forget. In fairness to the old lady, she was always kind to me, and I remember her taking me to the pantomime on the West Pier. I last saw her at Grandfather Wood's funeral in 1941. My mother felt her mood softening towards that sad old lady, no longer the despot of her childhood. I requested the day off from Griffith, Smith, Wade and Riley, where I was office boy, and was somewhat puzzled by the staff's amused response. Apparently asking for a day off to attend a grandfather's funeral was an office boy's stock excuse. My brother's nursemaid duties ended when at 14 he started work at Lelliott's, the builders and decorators in College Road. For a brief period I was planted in a creche in Bristol Road run by a Miss Hagger. I cried bitterly on my first day. And Aunt Maud, who was living in the little room at number 10, waved from her window which faced the back of the creche. My impression of this establishment, creech, as my mother called it, and sometimes screech, wet knickers. I don't think I attended for long, partly because my mother couldn't afford to send me there, so she carted me round with her. its errands, I don't remember. But I used to follow her in the mop and bucket round the church. A load must have been lifted from her shoulders when I began at Park Street Infants, a lovely little school which was demolished in the 1970s. Time rabs off the jagged edges of early memories. And I always recall number 10 with affection. The large sitting room held many a party, and strangely, the smoke-filled atmosphere was reassuring rather than unpleasant. Mother complained that the cost usually fell on her shoulders when she provided sandwiches and cakes. Aunt Maud was the convener, which Mother resented, since it was her front room. In the summer months, she took in lodgers. One I remember in particular. He was a seedy gentleman, middle-aged, blue-suited and bowler-hatted. On leaving with a lordly flourish, he gave me a tip. "All this?" I foolishly asked. "It was £0.50." He quickly snatched it back, replacing it with a penny. My mother, Mabel Emily. She stood there in her coat and best hat and announced, "I'm going to throw myself off Black Rock." George seemed only minimally concerned, but I burst into tears, clutching onto her and pleading with her not to take such a drastic step. She had it up to here, what with scrubbing floors for a pittance, my brother's uncertain temper, and me. Of course, I ought to have realised that you don't wear your best hat when you're about to fling yourself off a cliff, and that Mother was only off for a Guinness at the Branch Tavern in Easton Road. She had a hard life, as Aunt Cis once remarked. A wretched childhood, and service 100 years ago was no holiday. Her happiest times must have been before World War I, when she and her husband were caretakers in one of those villas opposite Preston Park, most of which have been demolished to make way for offices and flats. The furniture would have been under dust sheets for most of the year until the fashionable October season, by which time the Winkle and Whelp horde had gone back to London. There would have been a wine cellar, and I gather that parties below stairs with Aunt Cis, Uncle Alfred and Uncle Charles were not unusual. Less than 10 years after their marriage came the war, in which George, my father, was gassed, resulting, as my mother claimed, in his early death in 1924. His death certificate, however, stated that he died from endocarditis. Then came a hard time of making do on a widow's pension with a baby and my brother, aged 10, to provide for. About this time, she took on the job as a church cleaner at St Anne's, Burlington Street, now demolished. The job lasted into her 80s. She kept us both well fed and clad, and often went without herself. Sometimes she would examine her palms and say ruefully, "I must get my hands right." They were crisscrossed with deep etched lines, and sadly, she never did get them right. One afternoon in 1942, I arrived home to find her standing on the doorstep, tears in her eyes and telegram in hand. My brother had been dangerously wounded in the famous Malta convoy, and having lost her husband earlier, she now expected to lose her oldest son. Happily, George survived his wounds. Although driven at times to exasperation, my mother never despaired. She was, all the time I knew her, the eternal optimist with one dream: to have a cottage in the country surrounded by fields of cows and sheep. Sadly, this never materialised, and she had to make do with window boxes in which she planted those daisies which keep coming as the old flowers die off. She was delighted when we moved to White Hawk and had a back garden. She had a rare gift of holding my childhood attention with her stories, many of which were experiences of her own childhood and her wicked stepmother. She encouraged my early love of books and reading. This is a distinction I loved books for their own sake and had quite a little library by the time I was 12. She also had a morbid streak, relishing the ghoulish. There was a picture in Brighton Art Gallery to which she always returned called Decomposition. There was a naked body on a chair, I think partly covered by sheets and the head on the floor. I must have inherited her taste, because in the main gallery was another picture which fascinated me. The canvas was huge, at least 8 foot by 6 feet, and depicting a North Pole scene with abandoned tents and polar bears lapping up pools of blood. Recently, I asked the museum director what had happened to the picture, but she didn't know, explaining that exhibitions come and go all the time. I mentioned her summer visitors, and she had 1 or 2 regulars. There was the family from Leicestershire who spoke at the top of their voices, the reason becoming clear when they took me to Littlehampton in an ancient car. The vehicle was so noisy that conversation on a normal level would have been impossible. Then there was Kingswell, an aptly named chauffeur who drove a Grandad'S in an ancient Packard, beautifully kept and temporarily garaged in the mews. He wore maroon livery with peaked cap and gaiters and swore horribly. I don't think he was capable of stringing a sentence together without an oath. He was an inveterate gambler, and when his horse lost, he would say, "I was a damn fool." I think the Silks from the East End were Jewish, and when the son, purely for my entertainment, lowered a basket of stones from the upstairs window, it snagged on a drain pipe, scattering the contents over my head. I bled profusely from minor scalp wounds. I remember his mother sitting in a chair, rocking from side to side, wailing hysterically, "You've killed him! You've killed little Maurice!" He hadn't. My mother never remarried. Now, I think she had 1 or 2 offers, but remembering her own childhood, she said she didn't want to risk a stepfather for me. The photograph was taken when I was about 6. My mother hated it when it was displayed in Avery's window in St. James's Street. One of her acquaintances said she looked like a squashed lemon, which isn't surprising because it was being taken when my mother was suffering from one of her bilious attacks. When children had a birthday at Park Street Infants, they brought their cards for the headmistress to hold up in hall. "Maurice says he hasn't got any cards to show you, but he's bought some photographs." She held them up, and I can remember the children saying, "Ah." Was I embarrassed or delighted? I can't really remember. The infant school in Freshfield Place deserves a reference. It was a very happy place with kindly teachers. The reception class was taken by Miss Ray, a plump, motherly soul. She invited me to tell a story in front of the children, for which I was awarded a sweet. In the afternoons, we slumbered on little camp beds. Children must have been very compliant in those days. I can't somehow imagine today's infants being told to lie down and go to sleep without protest. My next teacher was Miss Macklin, who put her arms round me one afternoon when I cried bitterly about saying farewell to cousin Brenda, who'd taken me to school. My favourite was Miss Williams, who also used my apparent gift for storytelling at short notice. The headmistress, or in today's parlance, head teacher, was Miss Wallace, who held up photographs in assembly. Oh, on another tearful occasion, the cause of which I cannot remember, I said I had toothache. When she produced a form for the dentist, the ache quickly vanished. I must have displeased her once when I was one of the children in the Pied Piper of Hamelin, because as a punishment, I was removed from the cast and was obliged to watch rather than perform. The playground was enclosed by an old flint wall, shaded in one corner by, I think, a fig tree. Here, I collected a pocket full of snails, forgetfully putting them in with a piece of cake my mother had provided. When I took the slice out for a bite later, it was covered in snails. What else do I remember? Well, there was the occasion when my mother and Mrs. Williams took us both up to the races. Whether this was after school or during, I cannot remember. My mother put a shilling on a horse named Polar Bear. It must have been an outsider, for it came home at 20 to 1. The bookie refused to pay out, saying she put her money on a different horse. Bookies those days did not always merit the title. Honest Joe, and I remember one being pursued by angry punters down the side of Whitehawk Hill before the estate was developed. My father, George, I never knew him because he died about 5 months before I was born. And all those who did know him are now dead, so that I can reconstruct a character sketch only from the details they once provided. My problem is that even in these scanty descriptions contradict each other. To Aunt Edith, he was a jolly chap, while Mother said he was a retiring stick-in-the-mud sort. And she always warned me when I showed a lack of drive or ambition, don't be a Packham. My brother remembered him as a decent chap who didn't have the best of luck, and who once bought him a clockwork Hornby engine which he could ill afford. The photograph must have been taken when he was about 18, and my mother, who was apparently never satisfied with family photographs, didn't like it. She said he looked bleary-eyed and had apparently been on a binge. Why he was wearing a stiff collar and formal suiting for the occasion, I cannot guess. Perhaps that was the style of young bingers those days. In the next photograph, he looks older and with a touch of gravitas, and his clerical grey and watch chain. From what Mother told me, he had 2 clerical jobs: a loader's, a coal merchant, and sometime at the Rock Brewery. I came across a photograph of a brewery outing, and I was pretty sure that one of the men in the group was my father. But the man running the stall in Upper Gardiner Street could see I was interested and wanted an inflated price for it. My mother said he once corrected the grammar of his best friend, Frank Collis, who never spoke to him for a month. But my brother doubted this because he was a quiet and tolerant bloke who avoided arguments. Strangely, there is a grammatical nitpicking gene which I inherited from him. Recently, I contacted an old school friend via the internet, and he mentioned that I once corrected his English. Uncle Alfred confirmed my father's specific trait. He told me that he once threw in his clerical job at the Rock Brewery because of a difference with another employee. The only documentary evidence I have of my father, apart from the photographs, are his marriage and death certificates. There is the engraved back plate of a watch given him by his grandfather. This watch and chain was given to George Packham by his grandfather on his 21st birthday, July 30th, to insinuate being number 10 Carlisle Street in the county borough of Brighton, unto and to the use of my trustees, their heirs, executors, and administrators. Upon trust to permit my daughter-in-law, the widow of my deceased son, George Packham, to have the use thereof free of all rent, taxes, and other outgoings, cost of repairs and insurance, which I direct shall be paid out of my residuary estate, so long as any son of my deceased son, George Packham, shall be living and under the age of 16 years, or if my said daughter-in-law shall cease to reside number 10 Carlisle Street, aforesaid. Grandfather George bought houses, perhaps not of the upmarket variety, but I think profitably. Some of his money coming to my brother and me. Uncle Alfred said that he used to sit in the Bellevue Inn, Buckingham Place, which, as the name suggests, commanded a panoramic view of Brighton. Here he speculated in house purchases, and number 10 Carlisle Street was one of his investments. In the 1901 census return, my father George, then aged 17, was described as a cellar beer bottler. Was this his brewery work, or did pubs bottle their own beer? If so, the name of the hostelry is unknown, and at one time or another there were at least 4 run by the Packham family, 2 in George's time in Brighton, but I don't think he had any connection with them. More likely he worked at the City of London, which was managed by George Wood, my maternal grandfather. Perhaps that's where they met. They were of the same age. Both the pub and the street of the same name have long since disappeared. But in Victorian 90s, it did a brisk trade with rail workers. My mother described how legs of mutton were boiled in copper for the annual locomotive works dinner. George's grandfather, according to my mother, was very kind to him. There was a watch I mentioned, and he used to take his grandson to the Theatre Royal when the Guild and Sullivan operettas were on. Perhaps he felt sorry for George, who lost his father sometime between 1901 and 1914. My brother said he died of blood poisoning after treading on a rusty nail. I knew nothing of my father's recreational interests, but possibly it included music. Aunt Edith remembered his singing a jovial Monk Am I at an old piano. The performance and instrument, I suspect, both being below professional standard. He had two younger brothers, Frank and Laurie, who alas weren't very bright. They ended their days in a caravan somewhere in Surrey. Their sister Daisy was a kind, cheerful girl who married my Uncle Alfred. I never heard her utter an unkind word about anybody, and was a most patient, long-suffering woman. She worked at the Philstone Home for Working Ladies, and Miss H.F. Henbury was the superintendent. The title fascinates me. Who were these working ladies? From what genteel occupation had they retired, and how did they pass their time in the home? Miss Henbury was one of the church dusting and flower arranging ladies at St Anne's Church, and she had a soft spot for me. At one Sunday school treat, she gave me £0.50, a magnificent sum for a boy those days, and some years later gave me some books. George was puzzled by Aunt Daisy's accent, which was not working class. Did she adapt it for the Philstone home? But such pretentiousness was never in her nature. George's parents to me are a complete blank. My brother likened his mother to the sinister woman in the old dark house, and I can't remember ever having met her. The name of the film might well have applied to 10 Carlisle Street, where my mother said they lived between cups of tea in constant dread of neighbours. Their only entertainment might have been a gramophone. When my brother made his version with Meccano parts, he borrowed a record from them to try it out. He remembered the title, You Won't Find Many Pimples on a Pound of Pickled Pork. There were other records of like nature, some of which I later acquired, and played in the staff room of Patcham Secondary Modern School to the delight of the staff. Were the denizens of number 10 Carlisle Street amused? Which of the family it was, I don't know. But my mother said that one of them got religious mania and died of hypothermia praying by the bedside. My mother too had a weakness for embroidering facts. My dad didn't actually write any memoirs about his experiences in the war as an 18-year-old conscript for the Navy. But luckily, he did write a few things down for me when I was writing a book myself, which has a World War II backstory. I think he'd be pleased to know, well, he did know, it's my only book that actually sold in any great quantities, and only then in translation in Germany. But anyway, this is some of the stuff he wrote for me. So here we are. I mentioned Sub-Lieutenant Havers, father of the actor. He liked to mix with us CW candidates when we were swimming in Bizerta, first name terms. When he heard I went to school in Brighton, he mentioned he had a flat there. Very useful. What school? I couldn't bring myself to say intermediate, so I used the old name, York Place. Is that better than Brighton College? He asked. He once corrected my English. I had appended the word like after a sentence. He pulled me up. So you can say I had my English corrected by a future Lord Chancellor. When we were ammunitioning ship late at night after one action, we were all dog-tired. He appeared in a dressing gown, just presumably having had a shower, with a rat speared on his dirk or dagger. The men weren't amused. Shore leave in Alexandria. The most disreputable street was Rue des Sœurs, otherwise known as Sister Street. knocking shops and tattoo artists. I had my fortune told by an Arab in an old, disused mosque. He picked up a handful of sand and told me there was a woman who loved me very much with ginger hair, and I would have, I think, 12 children. I forget how much I paid him for this misinformation. Street traders sold dirty photos and little bottles of Spanish fly. Small piece in your drink turned you into a raving sex maniac, so it was claimed, sort of Viagra. As a matter of fact, there is a fly or moth called Cantharis, Greek for Spanish fly. Never tried it. Somehow didn't think I'd ever need it. They also sold little images reputed from Egyptian tombs, fake. I think it must have been in the Musée de Hygiene in Cairo that I had my first sex lesson. There was a gynecological gallery with a wax image of a child being born. I always thought it came out through the navel, I confessed to Bob of Dulwich College. He was most surprised by my ignorance. There was another gallery with a whole rank of penises, wax models sticking from the wall with Arab and French inscriptions. Various diseases, not pleasant. When we went for a meal in Cairo, we were not permitted into a cafe, used, I suppose, by officers. We were only ordinary seamen. An Arab took us to another cafe. When we asked for the suite, the waiter didn't know what we meant. But a diner in Fez explained that we were brought a confection which I'd never tasted then or since, a sort of marshmallow thing, and some dates, not dried, but fresh and delicious. It must have been here that an Arab girl sang a popular song of the time to an Arab accompaniment. Most interesting. You could recognize the tune, but somehow half tones had intruded. When we were in Bizerta, mentioned before, we took a whaler or a cutter, I can't remember which, and the officers in charge pinched sweet corn from an Arab's field. He appeared brandishing a knife, and I don't blame him. When we'd cut enough, we sailed away from the shore and the engine broke down. We had to signal for a boat to rescue us. I've always looked back on this piratical expedition with a touch of conscience, even though none of the sweet corns came my way, all for the officers. On another occasion, my mate and I went ashore, and a kindly old Arab cut a prickly pear from the hedge enclosing his field. He adroitly opened it to expose the succulent fruit inside and offered it to us, gratis. Rather different from the foregoing. By the way, a whaler's sailing boat has two pointed ends, I suppose in case the whale changes directions and pulls the boat the other way. The cutter only one sharp end. The sailing boats were made in two different ways. Carvel is where the planks join edge to edge, and clinker where they overlap. You asked about washing facilities aboard. They were quite civilized with hot and cold water taps and a shower. Only this used seawater and the result was sticky. You could buy a special soap for seawater, but I don't think it was very effective. In Nelson's time, the bogs were called heads, and I suppose they were in front of the ship, somehow arranged over the water. They were still called heads in my time, and were arranged like a sort of gallery amidships. Below decks, of course, with no doors. Nobody minded this, and you used to see chaps sitting on the bogs reading the paper. There were a number on one side and the others on the opposite side, arranged down the middle. They were a foot or so above the level of the deck, so you had the impression of being exalted on the throne. One cubicle had CDA in big red letters painted on the side, which I took to stand for Court Disease Ashore, but nobody minded using it. Crabs sometimes infested private parts, tiny beetle things. On some naval bogs you might see, "It's no good standing on the seat. Raleigh's crabs can jump 10 feet. Crabs itched terribly. Glad I never had them. When there was swimming off the ship, you were ordered not to use the bogs on the same side that swimming was taking place, for obvious reasons. Oh, by the way, the officers had a sick bog. There was a little vent on the quarterdeck with the label Sick Officers WC, rather more civilized than CDA. Ship's biscuits. I liked them. They were hard, rectangular, and about 1/3 of an inch thick. I think they were invented by the maker of Bath Olivers. Anyway, I never tasted them until a dear Chief Petty Officer Wren gave me some with cheese to take about the fishing boats where the grub, as I mentioned some time before, was basic. I think the Navy liked them because they were damp resistant and came in sealed tins. Churchill had the notion that we could attack Germany through the soft belly of Europe. As one American general remarked afterwards, was a tough old gut. Anyway, some of our soldiers were sent up to some Greek islands. You'll find this on your internet thing. And we had to supply them. We were dive bombed. Penelope was hit. Another cruiser collided and was put out of action. And eventually, Sirius was the only ship going up to the Dodecanese Islands, Kos and Leros. We had no air cover, no destroyers, and were an easy target for Junkers 87K, which were based on one of the islands. I must tell you that when we were recalled to Alexandria, a cheer went up. Hardly the right reaction, do you think? Anyway, we weren't going to get off that easy. The next time we went up, a 1,000-pound bomb hit the quarterdeck and we had 16 killed. Others wounded, of course. I can remember that Sunday when my friend from Lewis, another CW candidate, had just brought a tin of peaches from the canteen and was about to tuck in. The alarm bell rang and the usual clang of feet up the iron ladder. My friend was badly burnt. I reported to the bridge and a blood-stained first lieutenant struggled up the ladder to report the damage. Over the headphones, I heard that 20 more planes were coming in to finish us off, which of course was ridiculous. They wouldn't have wasted so many planes on one small cruiser. Now, believe it or not, at this false report, I felt a sort of sense of resignation. They say that when a tiger gets you, you feel the same. Anyway, the fire on the quarterdeck was doused, although the Oerlikon locker was firing ammunition all over the place because it was on fire. On the way back to Alexandria, the 16 men were buried at sea. They were enshrouded in hammocks with a practice shell to weigh them down. They were slid down a sort of chute under a Union Jack flag with the chaplain in charge of the service. There was singing in the wash place. Why? Because it was a grisly job putting mangled men into the hammocks. I hoped that I wouldn't get this job. I was given a spade to scrape bits of flesh off the deck. Neil Robinson's stretchers were hanging up next day with the ominous bloodstains. These stretchers were made of rods slid through sleeves in the canvas, and they could be rolled up tight around the casualty so you could get them through small gaps easily. Great big piles of wreckage from the ship on the dockside at Alexandria. Looking back, I wish I'd taken a bit of wood as a memento. After the attack, I took the place of one of the men elsewhere in the ship. "Don't go in there," warned one of the sailors. "Wardle's in there." Dead, of course. Later, I saw a man smoking a cigarette from a blood-stained packet. "Wardle's. He won't want them anymore," he said. So we just finish with 1938, when he gets moved out of his place in Kemp Town to a brand new housing estate, which they imagined would be paradise. In the summer of 1938, a woman from the housing department visited our flat in Marine Terrace Mews to find out if we were suitable tenants of a council house in Whitehawk. Her report must have been favourable, and my mother was delighted by the prospect of a house with a garden. Her recurring but never to be realised dream had always been a cottage in the country, with hollyhocks and wallflowers surrounded by fields of cows and sheep. But in the mews she had to be satisfied with window boxes. "It's right on the edge of the downs," she declared joyfully, which sounded idyllic. But the reality was somewhat different. Just over the garden fence was a small holding which was periodically manured with rotting fish, and a little further still in Sheepcote Valley was the municipal dump. She liked to call the small holding a farm, and often provided the hard-working girls with cups of teas, and was rewarded sometimes with a cabbage lobbed over the fence. At the time of our move to Whitehawk, my brother George was working as an electrician at Lelliot's, the builders, and his pride and joy was his boudoir grand piano, bought on hire purchase terms for £20 from Wadman's, the electrical shop where my mother worked. I don't know how they managed to get it up 2 flights of steep stairs in the mews, but getting out proved impossible until George removed the banisters, nailing them back afterwards. My brother had imagined had 2 windows in the living room and had drawn a plan positioned. Of course, the house was semi-detached with 1 window on each side, and his piano occupied much of the space and blocked off the entrance to the kitchen until he reversed the door. What was his broadwood and a largish Victorian oval table, a bookcase, armchairs and dining chairs, conditions were very cramped. The first meal we had in our new house was boiled ham, which we ate sitting on the floor with our backs to the wall. I suppose we hadn't yet arranged the furniture. Number 10 Marine Terrace Mews certainly wasn't a slum, but I suppose our move was part of the big migration from the less salubrious parts of Brighton to the new council estates